In a secluded corner of the world, where the restless waves kissed the rugged shore, lay a small fishing village, cradled by the arms of the sea. The air here was thick with the scent of salt, and the days were marked by the rhythm of the tides. The villagers, weathered by years of toil, knew the ocean as both friend and foe. Its bounty fed their families, yet its depths held secrets that no one dared to explore. At dawn, the fishermen would set sail, their boats cutting through the mist that clung to the water's surface like a shroud. The sea was their life, its whispers and roars as familiar as the beating of their own hearts. They respected it, revered it, for they knew that without it, the village would wither and die. The houses, small and worn, stood close together, as if seeking comfort from one another against the wild, unpredictable world beyond. They were built from the wood of ships long sunk, their beams creaking in the wind, echoing the groans of old timbers lost beneath the waves. The narrow, cobbled streets wound through the village like veins, leading to the edge of the water, where the villagers would gather each evening to share stories of the day's catch. But as night fell, a stillness would descend upon the village, a silence so profound that even the ocean seemed to hold its breath. The villagers would close their doors, draw their curtains, and listen to the sounds of the night, the sounds of a world beyond the reach of human understanding. It was in this fragile peace that the first murmurs began. At first, it was barely noticeable, a faint hum that blended seamlessly with the sounds of the night. The fishermen, weary from a day spent wrestling with the sea, paid it little mind. They heard it only in the quiet moments, just as sleep began to take them. A distant murmur that could have easily been the wind sighing through the gaps in their walls or the waves brushing against the shore. But as the nights wore on, the murmurs grew louder, more distinct, like whispers carried on the breeze, curling through the narrow streets and slipping beneath doors. The sounds were strange, unsettling, a low, rhythmic cadence that seemed to echo the patterns of the ocean itself, yet there was something undeniably human in their tone. The fishermen exchanged uneasy glances over their morning nets, but no one spoke of what they had heard. Superstition ran deep in the village, and to give voice to such fears might be to give them power. Yet each night, the murmurs returned a little closer, a little clearer, as if the sea itself were speaking, trying to convey a message just out of reach. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the village was bathed in the dusky glow of twilight, a group of men gathered at the water's edge, their faces etched with worry. The air was heavy, the silence between them thick with unspoken dread. And then, just as the first stars began to pierce the darkening sky, they heard it, more clearly than ever before. The sound was no longer just a murmur. It was a voice, a chorus of voices, rising from the depths, drifting over the waves with a chilling clarity that sent shivers down their spines. The words were indistinct, lost to the wind before they could be fully formed, but the tone was unmistakable, a call, a summons, an accusation. The men stood frozen, rooted to the spot as the voices swirled around them, growing in intensity, as if the sea itself had come alive, demanding their attention, their fear. And for the first time, the villagers began to understand that something was terribly, terribly wrong. The whispers, once a distant murmur, now clawed their way into the very hearts of the villagers. Night after night, the voices grew stronger, their words becoming clearer, though their meaning remained just beyond comprehension. They spoke in a language not entirely unfamiliar, yet twisted and garbled by the depths from which they came. Sleep became a fleeting luxury. The villagers would lie awake in their beds, eyes wide open in the darkness, straining to hear, yet dreading the moment when the voices would rise again. Each whisper seemed to carry a weight, a coldness that seeped into their bones, chilling them to their core. And always the voices called them by name. During the day, the villagers moved through their routines like shadows of their former selves, their eyes hollow and ringed with the purple bruises of sleepless nights. Conversations were terse, strained. They avoided the sea, once their source of life, now an ominous presence, an unknowable entity lurking just beyond their doorsteps. In the dead of night, the voices were the loudest. They slithered through the cracks in the walls, creeping into every corner of their homes, leaving no place untouched by their sinister presence. The children whimpered in their sleep, the elderly wept quietly in their chairs, and the once sturdy men of the village trembled in the dark, clutching at their blankets as if they could ward off the encroaching dread. And it wasn't just the voices. Strange things began to happen. Fishing nets left to dry would be found tangled and torn in the morning, as if shredded by unseen hands. Boats tied securely to the docks would drift out to sea, their ropes severed by some unknown force. The ocean, once so familiar, had turned into a living nightmare, a malevolent being that taunted them from the shadows. The village priest, a man of deep faith, attempted to bless the waters, to cleanse whatever evil had taken hold. But the moment his prayers reached the air, the voices surged in fury, drowning out his words with a cacophony of rage. The sea roared, the waves crashing violently against the shore, as if in mockery of his futile efforts. And then came the madness. One by one, the villagers began to crack. Some raved about visions in the water, ghostly shapes just beneath the surface, their eyes filled with sorrow and wrath. Others fell into a daze, wandering aimlessly toward the ocean, their faces slack, their minds lost to the siren call of the voices. The village, once so tightly knit, was unraveling, thread by thread, pulled apart by the whispers of the deep. And still, the sea whispered their names. It was in the midst of this waking nightmare that old Tomas, the village elder, finally spoke of a legend. A story so ancient and dark that it had been almost forgotten, buried under generations of silence. He gathered the remaining villagers in the small chapel, the only place where the voices seemed to falter, as if the thick stone walls could hold back their relentless assault. Tomas, his voice cracked and weary, recounted the tale passed down from his own forefathers, a tale of betrayal and blood. Long ago, he whispered, when the village was young and the sea even wilder, a ship had appeared on the horizon, battered by a storm, its sails torn and its crew desperate for refuge. The sailors, lost and half-mad from weeks adrift, begged the villagers for aid, pleading for food, water, and shelter. But the village was poor then, struggling to survive the harsh winters and unforgiving seas. The villagers feared that to share what little they had would mean starvation for themselves. So they hatched a plan, a terrible, unforgivable plan. They lured the sailors in with promises of help, leading them to the old caves beneath the cliffs, saying the waters there were calm and would provide safe harbor. It was a lie. The caves were treacherous, the currents inside violent and deadly. The sailors were led to their doom, their ship dashed against the rocks, their cries swallowed by the merciless sea. The villagers took what little the ship had carried, precious supplies that ensured their own survival through the winter. But the price of their betrayal was far greater than they could have imagined. For it was said that the spirits of those sailors did not rest. Their souls, denied the peace of a proper burial, had lingered, trapped between worlds, their anguish festering into a dark and vengeful force. The ocean had become their grave, and now, centuries later, it was their voice that rose from the depths, twisted by time and hatred. As Tomas spoke, the villagers' faces grew pale, their fear deepening as they realized the truth of what had been awakened. The voices were not merely the wind or the waves, not just echoes from the deep. They were the spirits of the damned, calling out for justice, for revenge against those who had wronged them so cruelly. And the villagers, the descendants of those who had committed the original sin, were the ones who must pay the price. Tomas's voice trembled as he finished, his eyes filled with sorrow. The legend had been true all along, and now the village faced the full fury of the spirits they had long tried to forget. The past, it seemed, could not be buried, and the sins of the fathers had returned to claim their due. The days blurred into nights, and the nights into something darker, more twisted, as the village fell deeper into the grip of the unseen forces that surrounded it. The voices, once faint murmurs, had become a relentless cacophony, a chorus of the damned that echoed through every corner of the village. leaving no mind untouched. The villagers could no longer ignore the voices, nor could they silence them. Every night, the calls became more insistent, more demanding, as if the spirits themselves were drawing nearer, reaching out from the depths to drag the living into their watery grave. Those who had once been strong, resolute, were now shadows of their former selves, their eyes hollow, their minds frayed by fear and exhaustion. And then, the madness took hold. It began with the youngest, those with minds still malleable, easily swayed by the whispers in the dark. The children spoke of dreams where the sea called to them, its voice sweet and soothing, promising peace in the depths below. They would wake with tears in their eyes, whispering to their parents that the sea was lonely, that it needed them, that it wanted them to come. Soon, others followed. The fishermen, once the lifeblood of the village, began to lose themselves to the call. They would stand at the edge of the shore, gazing out at the vast, dark expanse, their faces blank, their thoughts lost to the siren song that played endlessly in their minds. Some would wade into the water, as if in a trance, their feet sinking into the cold sand, their eyes fixed on the horizon. They would walk until the water reached their waists, their chests, their throats, until finally they disappeared beneath the waves, swallowed by the sea without a trace. The village became a place of despair. Families were torn apart as loved ones succumbed to the madness, their bodies claimed by the ocean, their souls lost to the voices. Those who remained were driven to the brink, clutching at anything that might save them. Prayers, rituals, desperate offerings cast into the water in a futile attempt to appease the spirits. But nothing worked. The voices only grew louder, more enraged, as if they fed on the fear and sorrow that now permeated the village. The air itself seemed thick with malevolence, a palpable force that pressed down on the villagers, suffocating them, pushing them ever closer to the edge. And in the midst of it all, the sea continued its relentless assault, pounding against the shore, a constant reminder of the inevitable doom that awaited them all. The villagers knew, deep down, that there was no escape, no salvation from the wrath that had been unleashed. They were trapped, ensnared by the sins of their ancestors, and the sea would not rest until it had claimed them all. The night was the worst time, when the voices reached their peak, howling like a storm that tore through the minds of the villagers, leaving them broken and desperate. They huddled in their homes, barricading doors and windows, but it was no use. The voices seeped through the cracks, through the very walls, whispering their names, calling them out into the darkness, into the deep. And still, the villagers resisted, clinging to the last shreds of their sanity, praying that somehow, some way, they could survive the night. But deep down, they knew the truth. The sea had come for them, and it would not be denied. In the heart of the terror, when the village teetered on the brink of complete collapse, a fragile spark of defiance flared among the remaining villagers. Desperation had pushed them to the edge, and now, with nothing left to lose, they gathered in the chapel, the last place of refuge, to make their final stand. The air inside was thick with fear, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows on the stone walls. Faces once familiar now seemed hollow, haunted by the relentless whispers that clawed at their sanity. But in those desperate eyes, there was also a flicker of resolve. They would not go quietly into the abyss. Tomas, the elder, stood before them, his voice trembling yet determined. He spoke of the ancient ways, of rituals meant to soothe restless spirits, offerings of food, of trinkets, of words spoken in reverence and remorse. The villagers clung to his words, grasping at the hope that perhaps, if they could just show their regret, their sorrow for the sins of their forebears, the spirits might be appeased, and the voices might finally fall silent. They moved as one, a procession of the damned, down to the shore where the sea churned angrily against the rocks. The wind howled, carrying the voices with it, but the villagers pressed on, clutching their offerings, bundles of fish, carved talismans, and scraps of parchment scrawled with prayers. They laid them at the water's edge, their hands shaking, their hearts pounding in their chests. Together, they knelt in the wet sand, the waves lapping at their feet, and they began to chant. Their voices were low at first, barely audible above the roar of the sea, but then they grew louder, more insistent, as if by sheer will they could drown out the whispers that had plagued them for so long. For a moment, it seemed to work. The voices faltered, their relentless assault easing as if they were listening, considering the pleas of the living. The villagers held their breath, hope flickering in their chests. The sea grew calm, the waves gentle and lapping softly against the shore, as if in response. But then, with a suddenness that ripped through them like a blade, the voices surged back, more powerful, more wrathful than ever. The air vibrated with their fury, the ground beneath their feet trembled, and the sea began to swell, rising up as if to swallow the village whole. The villagers cried out in terror as the waves crashed over them, dragging their offerings into the deep, rejecting their pleas. The wind screamed through the air, carrying with it the full force of the spirits' anger. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. The spirits were not to be appeased, for their vengeance was absolute. In that moment, the villagers knew they had been fools to think they could bargain with the dead. The voices that haunted them were not seeking reconciliation or peace. They wanted only one thing: retribution. The sea, the voices, the spirits, they all cried out for justice, and they would not rest until the blood of the living paid for the sins of the dead. As the storm of voices rose to a deafening crescendo, the villagers scattered, fleeing in every direction, but it was no use. The sea was everywhere, its cold grip reaching out, pulling them down into the dark, one by one, as the voices laughed and screamed, echoing their victory across the night. And still, above the roar of the waves, the villagers could hear their names, called out by those who had perished long ago, dragging them into the cold embrace of the ocean, where they would join the chorus of the damned. As dawn broke over the horizon, a weak, gray light filtered through the heavy clouds, casting a cold pallor over what remained of the village. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape of ruin. The streets were empty, the houses, those that still stood, were battered and silent. The sea, once a source of life, now loomed as a harbinger of death, its waves lapping at the shore with a deceptive calm. But the village was not at peace. Far from it. Those who had survived the night stumbled out into the open, their eyes wide with the horror of what they had witnessed, what they had barely escaped. They wandered through the wreckage, searching for loved ones, for any sign that life might continue, that something might have been spared. But the sea had claimed its due. Bodies lay scattered along the shore, their faces twisted in terror, their hands frozen in desperate attempts to ward off the inevitable. And still, the voices remained, no longer a furious roar, but a low, relentless murmur that haunted the air, weaving through the ruins, a constant reminder that the curse had not been lifted. It was then that the final truth was revealed, a truth that struck the survivors with the force of a dagger to the heart. In the cold light of day, they uncovered the hidden history of their village, buried deep in the crumbling records kept by the priests, an account of the betrayal, of the bloody pact their ancestors had made to ensure their survival. The elders had known the truth all along, had known that the price for their prosperity had been paid in blood, but they had kept it hidden, hoping that the passage of time would erase the sins of the past. But the past could not be buried, and neither could the dead. The voices that had tormented them, the spirits that had risen from the depths, were not strangers, not the souls of unknown sailors. No, they were their own blood, the ancestors who had been sacrificed in a terrible rite, offered up to the sea in exchange for the village's survival all those years ago. It was their own kin who had returned to exact their vengeance, their own blood that cried out for retribution. The realization struck the villagers like a thunderbolt, the weight of their ancestors' sins crushing them. The voices had been calling to them not as strangers, but as family, demanding justice, demanding that the debt be paid in full. And now, with the village decimated and their lives shattered, the survivors understood that there was no escape, no redemption. The curse was in their blood, woven into the very fabric of their existence, and it would haunt them and their children until the last of their line had been claimed by the sea. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the survivors began to leave, one by one, abandoning the village to its fate. Some walked into the sea, their minds broken, seeking to join the voices that still called to them, while others fled inland, their footsteps haunted by the knowledge that they could never truly escape. And as the last of them disappeared from sight, the village returned to silence, save for the whispers that floated on the wind, drifting out over the water. The sea, now calm and still, held its secrets close, waiting for the next generation, the next victims to inherit the curse that could never be undone. For in the end, the sea always remembers, and it never, ever forgives.